And welcome to Behind the Headlines with Byline Times. I'm delighted to be joined by our chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer, and our special guest, yes, Nafeez Ahmed. He is our investigations reporter at large and author of a forthcoming Byline book, Alt-Right. The subtitle is, Nafeez?
It's the global war to destroy the West from within.
Nafeez, for the last 5 years, you've been working for Byline Times, and many years before then, is a brilliant reporter, explorer, investigator of these global networks of money and ideology. And so today we'll be talking about the recent riots in the context of international movements, especially in the US, dark money and dirty data, and also the role of the oligarchs. Yes, Carol Cadwalader coined that term. She deserves the credit about a month ago, and everybody's using it. The oligarchs, people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Zuckerberg, who are behind massive movements of information, and we believe ideologically and technically are responsible for the rise of populism in the far right. So, Nafeez, we should talk about our front page. It's called Who Lit the Fuse? You lead our new print edition. It's out in the shops. You can see it on the website. You can download the PDF now. And obviously, you showed that there were US and European connections to the riots that happened a few weeks ago.
Well, absolutely. I think Tommy Robinson, his real name, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, was obviously at the epicenter of the riots in terms of a key voice in instigating. And there's videos of him speaking to his followers and actually telling them that you need to rise up. And this is while the riots are going on. And of course, he was also one of the chief sources of disinformation. So I know some of the disinformation came from all sorts of obscure places, but he latched onto it, amplified it, spread it to millions of people. And he was also amplified by Elon Musk. And
yes.
I think 1.2 billion views on his posts overall across an absolutely colossal impact.
He'd been unbanned. He'd been previously been banned, and earlier this year, along with Andrew Tate, another key influencer who apparently persuaded Nigel Farage to believe it. Elon Musk brought him back about a year ago, didn't he?
That's right, yeah. I think the most fascinating elements around this story were the backdrop of who essentially has been working with Robinson to amplify him in the years preceding the riots. So I think really for me, there were two key individuals that Tommy Robinson was connected to. One of them is a fellow called Patrick Byrne, who it turns out had actually set up a Give, Send, Go account for him. Give, Send, Go is a well-known alternative to legitimate crowdfunding platforms for charities and things like that, which is often dominated by the far-right Christian extremist groups, neo-Nazis. The Proud Boys have used it, who they're a designated extremist white nationalist group in America. So all sorts of very dodgy groups use it. And Patrick Byrne had set up a crowdfunding campaign for him for his banned film called Silenced, where he created all sorts of disinformation around the whole narrative around migrants and immigration, but centered around a young Syrian schoolboy refugee. Now, without going into the details of that, what's interesting is who is Patrick Byrne? And that opens up a whole bizarre can of worms. And Patrick Byrne is a multimillionaire. He's quite a well-known household name in America. He used to be CEO of Overstock.com, which is like an Amazon-type platform in America. But he was also a staunch Trump ally. And in the last few years, went through a very conspiratorial bent after having had a strange romantic relationship with a Russian spy.
Maria Butina, yes, amazing. The Russia connection. She was extradited, wasn't she, alleged to be a spy because she kind of penetrated the National Rifle Association. Guns are banned in Russia, by the way, handguns. Nobody can hold a gun unless you're in the militia. But she was very much pushing for the Fourth Amendment. And he had a relationship with her, did he?
Yes, he had a relationship. And it turned out that she had quite successfully penetrated conservative Republican circles. And there was even, I think it was a House Senate Intelligence Committee inquiry into this. And they concluded that she had attempted to set up a secret communications back channel with Russian intelligence for the Trump campaign. And this is what she was trying to do. That much we know, she was trying to do that. And it turned out that Patrick Byrne was involved in all of this. Now, he then released his own story and said that he was actually tasked by the American deep state.
Oh, by the deep state.
To have a relationship with her. And
yeah.
so he quite...
Great alibi, that
Great
one.
alibi. Fantastic alibi.
Deep state told me to do it. Andrew Tate told me to do it.
We've all used that one, surely.
Absolutely.
Done one for the country.
Really strange. But, even after that, he continued this relationship with her. He basically actually provided millions of rubles for her political campaign in the State Duma, where she was trying to campaign to become a member of parliament. And that relationship continued long after all of this. And by the way, this is not theory. She was convicted. She did time in prison,
Yes.
was released, went back to Russia, where she was then funded by Patrick Byrne again. So what's really strange is a couple of days into the riots, Tommy Robinson actually tweets out a cover of a book by Patrick Byrne where he talks about all of this. And it includes a foreword by Michael Flynn, of all people, General Michael Flynn, who was, of course, Trump's national security advisor for a very brief period of time before he was forced to resign because it turned out he was lying about his secret conversations with Russian officials, and I think it was the Russian ambassador at the time, all about sanctions on Russia and so on and so forth. So that was one element of it. So he had this relationship with Patrick Byrne. There was some money coming in.
And Byrne also was supporting in some way, verbally or financially, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, was he?
Yes, well, he was, in fact, involved in the insurrection. He went to a rally on the day. He had met in the Trump White House with Michael Flynn, with Donald Trump, where we know that he was among a group of people who were essentially encouraging Trump to do all sorts of things to essentially steal the elections in one way or another, including, for instance, getting either private mercenaries or the National Guard to literally take control of election machines as part of the process. Astonishing demands were made. So he's known as an insurrectionist.
Right.
And since then, he's set up a number of organizations. I think one of them is the American Project, which has been financing election denial and promoting election conspiracies for the last year and a half or so at scale. And so he is actively attempting to undermine the electoral process in America. So that direct line of influence between Robinson really raised the question of whether what happened just a month after a Labour government came in, was this Britain's January the 6th moment?
Well, this is why I do speculate on this in the editorial of the print edition, which is also on the front page underneath Josiah's piece of the digital edition. There are the European connections, but let's focus on the American ones for the time being. So your inference, your suggestion is that Americans were very interested in fomenting trouble in the UK, at least some of the people around Trump. And also we had people like Elon Musk very interested. I suggested, just looking back, I don't know what you feel about this, Nafeez, you probably haven't read my piece, I've read yours, he hasn't read mine, is that just as in 2016, Brexit was a petri dish, the EVU and the EU referendum for the Trump campaign later that year, Steve Bannon being a key figure. Steve Bannon's still a key figure here. Earlier this year, he met with Liz Truss on a panel and saying, Tommy Robinson is a hero. She nodded along, didn't seem to object. And there will be a nationalist uprising in the UK. Now, why are Americans so suddenly interested in British politics this summer?
It's a really good question. I think it's something that is an ongoing issue that post-Brexit has almost become a bit of a lightning rod, because answering this question really opens up that can of worms that we were talking about, that there is a deeper vision and agenda at play here. For a long time, Bannon, Mercer...
Robert Mercer, I might explain, just in case we mention his name, he's the hedge fund billionaire, especially his daughter Rebecca, very, I would say, hard right. They funded Breitbart, they funded Cambridge Analytica, and a lot of super PACs for Trumpets. Carry on.
And various other, you mentioned the term broligarch, these tech bros who aspire to have this big political influence. We mentioned Elon Musk, there's also Peter Thiel. There seems to be an emerging shared ideology. That's not to say that they all agree with each other on everything, but a shared ideology around what they think needs to happen to world order. And one of those things, the reason Britain is so important in this is, of course, Britain's role in Europe and the European Union and acting as a bulwark against Russian expansionism. Now, that whole political structure has been increasingly questioned by all of these different actors in different ways, whether it's people on the Russian side who've obviously questioned it from a Russian expansionist point of view, but there's also these very different questions coming from people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, who are looking at this structure and looking at the structure of European and British democracy as this huge transatlantic thing, which is actually restricting their influence and restricting their capability to expand capital and to pursue their ideology, which is mingled with all sorts of different strange ideas, even around white supremacism, elements of eugenics, the idea that these failed liberal institutions are essentially mollycoddling the population and allowing unproductive people to take control, whether they're black people, Muslims, migrants. It's all kind of bound up with this idea. So get rid of that structure, get rid of those political structures, and then you get to solve the problem. So there's all sorts of different literature and books which are hinting at that kind of ideology. And one of the most significant ones was a book which actually you highlighted in your tweet recently, Peter, by William Rees-Mogg, who is Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad.
Former Times editor, right?
Yes, and he co-wrote this book with an American venture capitalist, and Peter Thiel wrote a foreword or a preface to it in 2020, and he claims that this book inspired him before he founded PayPal.
It's called The Sovereign
Individual, and it's a fascinating blueprint for what can only be described as the comprehensive destruction and fragmentation of democracies around the world. And it says and predicts, it tries to predict in a neutral fashion, that democracies are essentially in terminal decline. And what we have today as sovereign states will be broken into and fragmented into millions of smaller entities, which will be controlled entirely by sovereign individuals, many of whom will be tech bros.
Right. Yes. Yes. It's very.
And they will have complete and utter control, regardless of the will of the people in those areas. And they talk about the commercialization of sovereignty. And it's an astonishing and bizarre vision, but you can see that it's aligned with the Russian, almost Alexander Dugin, and his extraordinary vision of what he wants to see happen in Europe, for instance, which is the total destruction of the European Union, fragmentation of the ability of European nations to work together as a bulwark. And again, the destruction of democracy, the move towards techno-authoritarianism. All of this aligns. So you have these different actors, they have different ideas, different views, but they're aligning in this strange kind of way.
So Peter Thiel, I think he's caught on an interview comparing it with Weimar Germany in the 1930s, and basically saying we're going to have to change the open window and go for those kind of solutions, i.e. the overturning of democracy, with obviously with the Nazis. It didn't end well for the Nazis. And it did make me think, as a final thought on this, not a final thought, you must read Nafeez's great work on this on Substack, our supplement. You've written about long-termism and the oligarchs. But in the 1930s, if we're going to make that analogy, the crucial thing for Nazism that it was kind of corporatism, wasn't it? It had relationships with key oligarchs, particularly in Krupp and IG Farben and big corporate. So there was a few industries that did well out of democracy being closed down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happening now, I mean, there have been a number of commentators who's observed that people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, they're playing the role that people like Henry Ford played at that time. Henry Ford obviously was famous for the automobile revolution and the huge technological disruption that brought. It changed life, changed everything. And yet he was an ardent anti-Semite and Nazi sympathizer and used his position essentially to try and sway America into that direction. And we see that happening here with Elon Musk now clearly laying his stake in the ground. And I think what I'm really concerned about is it's not so much that there is a fixed conspiracy, which would be a mistaken way of looking at this, but it's the alignment that is emerging in a way, somewhat organically. There are obviously conspirators. There are far-right conspirators in different groups and organizations with making different plans. And some of those people have discussed very blatantly the idea of fomenting riots and civil wars in the UK, in Europe, which is something we should be really concerned about.
It's a very good point, Nafeez, because sometimes we're called conspiracy theorists, and often we're looking at a confluence of interest and these alliances, even albeit temporary. But Elon Musk did say civil war is inevitable here, which for anybody sitting in sunny Southwark would just be ludicrous. But this is very scary things to hear from somebody 6,000 miles away.
And the question is, why is he saying that? So when he started saying stuff like that, I straight away was reminded of the far-right tropes that have been put out systematically by key people within Europe, in the European far-right. And one of them is, for instance, Morten Messerschmidt,
who's mentioned in Nafeez's article as well.
In my article.
Yeah.
And he's a Danish People's Party leader at the moment. He's a very, very prominent politician in Denmark, worked his way up and worked very, very closely with Nigel Farage over the last few years. He partnered with Farage in the European Parliament, in the first parliamentary group that Nigel Farage had helped set up there, with many other far-right parties. So they knew each other very well. And what's interesting is Morten, for many years, was an advocate of this idea that there are going to be race wars in Europe. And it comes back to the far-right great replacement theory, which experts will say is, again, this kind of emerging shared ideology. It's been promoted by many different voices within the far right.
It goes back to the Eurabia idea where Anders Breivik killed over 100 people in Norway, wasn't it?
That's
this
right.
idea, that was the gates of Europe and all that.
That's right. So the general idea is that there is a conspiracy of liberals and can sometimes involve Marxists and Jewish people. There's a conspiracy, and it involves in some way liberal institutions allowing mass migration from inferior countries, which are overwhelmingly black, brown, often Muslim, is the way it's framed. And the rhetoric can shift in different ways. Sometimes it's Jewish institutions that are blamed for doing it. Sometimes it's the EU that's blamed for doing it. Sometimes it's all of them. And this influx is going to replace native white people. That's the argument. And so it's an existential threat to the white race.
Therefore worth killing.
It's a war. It's an actual war. That's the way it's framed. Yeah. And part of the flank of this are these growing diaspora populations who are essentially these immigrant populations. Again, the rhetoric, Morten Messerschmidt, when he talked about this in an interview in 2009 that I transcribed, which since then has been deleted. And of course, we went to him for comment. He didn't want to say anything about it, but didn't decline or didn't even reject the way that we were interpreting it. He said very, very clearly that he believed that these Muslim enclaves in Europe would turn into insurgencies. They would try to forcefully implement Sharia law. This would lead to race wars. And we have to learn from what happened in Vienna, the gates of Vienna, which was a historical, the Ottoman Empire.
500 years ago.
Yes. Yeah. So how we threw off the Turks, we have to do it again. Again, the rhetoric is actually violent rhetoric. It's saying that Europeans are going to have to take up arms against. And when you read between the lines, it's astonishingly frightening. It's against Muslims in our midst who are trying to take us over by stealth.
That rhetoric, just be clear, that percolates to people like Farage, to people like the right-wing press, this idea of fighting age. I mean, I saw also...
And the word invasion as well.
The word invasion, the word revolt, uprising. I noticed that Jordan Peterson, who is this Canadian psychologist and academic of the alt-right, I would say, and Elon Musk calling Humza Yousaf a scumbag, and then Jordan Peterson saying even worse is Sadiq Khan. So this rhetoric is also the acceptable side. It gets laundered up to the mainstream press and all to these legitimate figures.
Yeah, it's really frightening the way in which these particular voices are using their platforms to mainstream these ideas and make them normal, make them legitimate. And that is what, it's kind of like, there's a term our mutual friend, Dave Troy, who's also been published by Byline, has talked about, he uses a term, networked insurgency, which is a really great term, I think, because that's what it is. It's not just a particular faction. It's the way it comes together and how people like Musk are using his platform to essentially take these different things and amplify them into what we can now see. You go into the virtual realm, that disinformation is amplified on a huge, unprecedented scale, and it can trigger social unrest in places where there's a spark that can be used, where you can find a spark, it can trigger something. And that's the most dangerous thing. And that's where you can't predict it. Because you don't know when the spark might fly. No one could have known that the Southport murders, for instance, could have happened. Anything can happen.
It's combustible. They created combustible, and it requires one spark. It's not that spark, it's the other spark. The other thing I notice very much is that everyone's piling in on this, Jordan Peterson. Whether it's mass groupthink, you know what I mean, or hue and cry. I had weird Italian, Spanish, Dutch, I think, accounts all retweet commenting, mainly from the right. It was clearly a Europe-wide as well as a US movement, and all animated by this similar ideology and the technology of which some people call stochastic terrorism, i.e. you don't directly get a bomb or a rifle and shoot people. You whip people up with this disinformation, and that somebody eventually will, like Joe Cox was murdered during the EU referendum because Britain first was the killer said. There's such an atmosphere of hatred and fear and existential dread that somebody's going to act.
Yeah, and I think that's the new phase that is opening up. And I think when someone like Elon Musk then doubles down against the backdrop of people like Messerschmitt saying there's going to be civil war, and then we know that on the back of that, that's not just a theory. Tommy Robinson, I think Hope Not Hate did the investigation in 2015, where they found that Tommy Robinson was working with Anne-Marie Waters, went on to join Britain First and all the rest of it. And they were actively planning, they wanted to provoke Muslims into riots that would then clash with so-called native whites, resulting in Muslim and non-Muslim race riots that would escalate across the country. That was their plan. And thankfully it didn't work. Even the police were involved in investigating that, and it didn't happen. But we know that that was the idea. There was a real plan to do something like that. So it's not theoretical. So when someone like Elon Musk is then, and people have looked back at how long have you been talking about this? And he's been talking about it for months.
Yes. Yeah,
he's been perhaps longer than that. And you look at the wording, it's systematic. He's systematically trying to brainwash people on the platform into expecting a civil war in Europe, that it's inevitable. And so he's channeling this ideology into the platform, into the network, and making it normal. And I think that's what's very dangerous about the situation that we find ourselves in, is that it's an inflection point. We've got that alignment now between these different platforms. The other platform was Rumble, the Canadian platform. It's the only platform, I think, where RT, Russia Today, the state-owned Russian broadcasting network, is able to broadcast into the West. And it's owned by Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance,
who is currently the Republican nominee for vice president. And it's owned by J.D. Vance as well. I hadn't realized. I know that Peter Thiel invested in J.D. Vance. Just very briefly back to the UK, because we have an edited version of a fantastic Paul Mason Substack, which just shows you, and it's in the newspaper, how coordinated Tommy Robinson was with Danny Tomo and all these people like Lawrence Fox, this group of influencers. And we do know, because we've written about it, Tommy Robinson has connections in Russia. So we have all these forces together. I want to bring Josiah into this. So you've written a report this week, which is on our front page, about how British democracy could protect it, because we have two forces here, at least. Probably got some Modi money and some Chinese money and some Iranian money, but we have Russian interference. We know that they are worth certainly amping up the riots. They certainly is in their interest to amp up the sense of Britain falling apart. It did affect our economy, it affected tourism. These are not random things. And also clearly American money. What was this report saying, Josiah, and what's the plan to defend British democracy from foreign interference?
Yeah, I spoke to quite a few experts over the past week about these risks of foreign interference. And I think what really struck me was, A, how persistent the warnings have been over the risk of foreign interference in the UK over the past decade or so. And then on the other side, just the total lack of action to do anything about it. It just seems like there is an absolute blockage that seems to prevent certainly the last government doing anything to close the loopholes. And there are a lot of loopholes. And I think one of the big ones that is often talked about is just how wide open our political funding system is to things like foreign donations. And actually, in the past few months, in the past year or so, those doors have got even wider. So
tell us why, though, because you can increase the amount of you can donate. This is under the Conservative government. By the way, this was not the doing of Keir Starmer, who's only been there 6 weeks. Boris Johnson was clearly incredibly relaxed about receiving foreign funding into British politics.
Yeah, we saw under him and his two successors the number of overseas voters, for example, who could vote. The limit on the number of years you could live abroad and still vote and, crucially, donate to political parties in the UK was completely abolished. So you can now live abroad. You can live in Russia for 50 years after leaving the UK and donate literally an unlimited sum to UK parties. Those sorts of things passed with almost no debate, actually, almost no scrutiny. And in the final months before the general election, the amount that could be spent by political parties was nearly doubled as well. So we see these confluence of reforms or changes to how our democracy works. Basically, more loopholes effectively being added in terms of the risk of foreign interference. But I think one interesting development, and certainly something that Nafeez has written lots about, and others at Byline Times, is we do often think about Russian and Chinese interference when we think about those sorts of risks from hostile actors. But increasingly, it feels like some of the biggest risks have actually come from the far right in the United States. And particularly with Elon Musk's control of X now and having that platform, we are seeing what is effectively foreign interference in UK election debates come from tech bros in the United States, amplifying mis and disinformation. And it doesn't really matter whether that's coming from Russia, China, or the United States. The fact is that we are seeing a deluge of well-funded mis and disinformation come into UK politics.
But I was amused because, in fact, Andrea Jenkins said, the former MP and minister, Elon Musk for Prime Minister. And we had Kemi Badenoch, leading contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party in the forthcoming ballots, praising Douglas Murray, who's been seen with Musk and making incredibly inflammatory comments, and Liz Truss also praising Elon Musk. And it did strike me that this is just the new twist of an old tradition of conservatives sucking up to American billionaire moguls like Rupert Murdoch. But these are the new guys in town. You've got to be nice to them. It all seems very difficult to regulate against. There's the Online Harms Act, isn't it? That doesn't really work. Some people say this is suppressing free speech, but surely in America they have quite tough legislation, the home of free speech, Foreign Agents Registration Acts. They have to declare slightly better than we do, don't they? Even though they have these awful super PACs, they have to declare their donations. And sometimes the fees, you've worked who the think tanks in Tufted Street and Henry Jackson Society get their money through the American filings, isn't it? Because they're a little bit more transparent. So what is the plan, and is Labour listening?
You raised a big issue with the Online Safety Act, which was originally meant to tackle some of these big issues. And actually, big parts of it that were meant to tackle mis and disinformation were pulled from it. They were turned down by Tory MPs on these grounds of free speech. So many of those safeguards are no longer in there. There's still parts of this act which haven't come into force yet. There's time for Labour to shape how that is implemented, particularly through Ofcom, the communications regulator. Another thing that's running alongside this is, you touched on US registering spies. We currently don't have anything like that in the UK.
Well, they're not technically spies, are
Sorry,
they? Foreign agents.
Foreign influencers, yeah, exactly. Organisations that are funded by foreign states, and we don't have a register of that in the UK. That is due to come into force. I've been speaking to government sources this week and trying to work out when exactly that might be, but all they will really say is it's likely to come into force this year. So that is on its way. Whether that will really make much of a difference when many of these problems are social media, bot farms and things like that, or just literally far-right individuals who are able to pump huge sums of money into this stuff from wherever they are in the world. If they're in the UK, that's kind of irrelevant. They can certainly send content to be seen by British voters. But yeah, I think it's probably too early to say whether they will shift the dial at all. I think another factor really that has been downplayed by the UK media, certainly in recent weeks, is just the role that the British media have had in fomenting some of this unrest. And that's something that they're obviously very reluctant to talk about. We have to be careful when we're pinning all of the blame on one or two rich billionaires that we forget to talk about the rich people who own much of the UK media. So yeah, definitely big questions about the role that major institutions beyond social media platforms have played in all this.
But just stepping it back a bit, so If, as my thesis is, or suggestion, there was an attempt to use Britain as a petri dish, there were lots of talk before the election of uprising. There was a sense that Nigel Farage was wrong-footed initially by an early election call. They had anticipated this in October. And then this would have fit into a pre-election pattern. But just stepping back and look at the British people, particularly, and we have a spread on the paper, all those anti-racism marches, it's not going to work, is it? I mean, it is horrific what they're planned. Many people have been in fear of their lives the last 2 weeks. Lots of policemen injured. Over 1,000 arrests. And some of these are just stupid people going along thinking if you hear the statements in court, like somebody's had like 200 convictions saying, well, these migrants are wasting money when it's hundreds of thousands. But do you think we are, in a way, have a bit like the Battle of Cable Street? Not that I remember, I'm not that old. We have shown them down.
I think we have. But I think we should not overlook the fact that this is not going to go away. And I think what we're starting to see is that what happens at the ballot box is not the answer. I think that's what we've seen here. It's not even the ballot box is where a lot of the fighting is taking place. And what we're learning is that we need to strengthen democracy. But how to do that? So if we win the election or we lose the election, that's not really the issue here. What's really going to be the issue is how do we strengthen that civic resilience, right? Because that's what they're trying to fracture. Now, I think what we've seen in Britain is that that's going to be very hard to do. Right. The vast majority of people clearly just have no truck with this. But what is dangerous about it is that we're seeing that there are a sizable minority who are beginning to think that some of these ideas actually make sense. And so even though it's even a tiny minority that is, we're going to go out in the street and start causing a ruckus, but behind that, there is still a sizable minority of people, and the polls do bear that out.
Mainly Reform voters, isn't it? It's like
Reform voters.
30% of Reform voters thought the rioters, protesters had a point.
Yes, exactly. And I think looking at what's happening in the United States and different parts of Europe will wake us up to the fact that public opinion can be influenced in very nefarious ways. In the United States, the Republican Party has now become a full-blown fascist party. And for the whole party to undergo that metamorphosis in that way over not a very long period of time, obviously the campaigning and the work started years before Trump, but accelerated under Trump and accelerated since then. And since then, we've seen that the Never Trumper movement has become weaker. And so that's millions and millions and millions of ordinary Americans, Republican Americans, who have been drawn into believing crazy ideas, absolutely crazy ideas about migration, swallowing these ideas around the Great Replacement theory without knowing what it is that they're being told. And I think that's the risk. You go to Germany with the Alternative for Germany, AfD. They are now the third largest party, the most popular party. And they've had ups and downs. They've had some scandals and things, and they've been affected by that. Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, they didn't get where they wanted to, but it was so close. And they've still had massive growth in the parliament now. And I think that's the trajectory that we're seeing, is the trajectory unmistakably of the last decades that the far right has gained in popularity. And it's just happening incrementally. So why is that happening? I think it's two things. One is that basically liberal or progressive or mainstream institutions or whatever you want to call them, they in a way are failing to do what they're supposed to do. They're failing to deal with the issues that ordinary people are dealing with every day on an everyday basis. And so that means people are looking for what's the answer, what's the alternative. If the liberal way of seeing things isn't the right way, isn't working, then there must be something else. So that's one thing.
A new narrative, the narrative of post-war progress, of social democracy, or even Thatcherite, you'll get your own house, you'll do better. That's failed since 2008.
Yes.
So what's the reason we're not doing better? Is that what you're saying?
I think to some extent people are genuinely pissed off. And I think that's why, for instance, the Conservatives were routed. That doesn't mean that suddenly everyone's a hook, line and sinker Labour lover. Clearly not. A lot of these people were previously Tory voters. But they're unhappy. And everyone is dealing with these growing social challenges, economic challenges, and so on and so forth. But how do we solve that? Do our existing mainstream institutions genuinely have meaningful answers to those issues? Are they dealing with those issues properly? And the longer they don't, it creates that space for extremists to come in. And of course, the other side of it is that the extremists are having a playing field with promoting disinformation. And they're not just doing it on the extreme. And that's the most frightening thing of all, is that they have successfully, over the last few decades, positioned themselves within the mainstream. They've taken the center.
Yes.
So the Conservative Party is a mainstream party. The Republican Party is a mainstream party. And it's mainstream media institutions. In America, it's like the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. Here, it's the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, which are every day churning out actual far-right nonsense.
Well, BNP policies, effectively, most of them. What people object to often about the fascist analogy, and it's not a Nazi analogy, that's slightly different, the fact is there aren't militias, that isn't street violence. But that's changed, hasn't it? This is proving in a different way with black shirts or brown shirts or whatever the massed ranks of 20th century totalitarianism and fascism was. We're getting this new, what did Dave Troy call it?
Dave Troy called it a networked insurgency.
Yeah, so we have networked fascism, if you like. Fascism originally those bundles, didn't it? It was the idea of the fascia. You couldn't break us, all the sticks put together. And what it throve on was an idea of uniformity, marching, militias, organizations, boys groups, and things like this. Maybe there's a dysfascia, kind of, but it's certainly a good analogy. Josiah, do you feel this threat too? I mean, we had 2 pieces published this week, one by Kat Denkinson about how it wasn't a working class phenomenon, the riots. Another by Adam Barnett, I think, looking at Matthew Goodwin's analysis of it, where this is the disaffected white working class. What's the truth of that? Does that analysis strike you as... So I'll raise it a bit higher. Nafeez says we've got liberal institutions ought to stand up, right? So is that economically better facilities, outlooks for people in poor, left-behind neighborhoods? But is it also standing up to the limits of free speech? So I'm getting, if you just prosecute these people for inciting riots and saying we're going to kill Muslims, it's thin end of the wedge, nobody will support Labour. But that seems to be the classic thing about liberal tolerance, that it's got to be intolerant about certain things. This is moving off journalism way, it's more personal opinion, that's the way to make that we should fight a bit more intolerantly for tolerance.
Yeah, it's the idea of muscular liberalism, isn't it? It has to be strong to defend itself. I was quite struck, actually, watching some of the videos of the riots over the past few weeks. It was almost impossible to spot a woman in the crowd, almost without fail. And there have been a few convictions now of women involved, but it was very, very much largely, maybe 90% male, not actually surprisingly all young either. There's a lot of middle-aged white blokes taking part in these riots.
And on one sample, early one, 70% had previous criminal convictions.
Yeah, and I don't think we should underestimate one aspect to this, which is, there is unrest and there is anger at UK institutions. But actually, some people just, when they see an opportunity to have a bit of a fight and have a few cans and hang out with their friends and throw a few rocks, there will be people who will take this.
And loot a few shops.
Indeed, and particularly we've seen these stats of majority having previous convictions. It is an opportunity to come out and possibly not get caught and to do this. So, you do need to have a strong response to things like this. I think another bizarre element of all this is you see the tables completely turned, where you get outlets like GB News and far-right figures who absolutely livid over climate protests, calling for people to be hung up and drawn and quartered, now saying, the police are being too harsh. People like Lee Anderson saying they're just slightly misguided. They're not thugs. They just want to have a good time and they can throw a brick or something. That's fine. It is bonkers. We're seeing a total reversal of, and it's kind of thing of motivated reasoning, right? On the back burner, on the down low, they support what they see as the cause of these rioters, and therefore they will find ways to justify them, however convoluted those arguments might be.
So, Nafeez, just one of your thoughts on that. You mooted this, we got to show resilience. And maybe this will be our closing thought, because it's good to look positively at the future. There was a great interview with Nick Cage on Steve Colbert last. I put it on my Twitter feed. It's amazing. He's been through these tragedies. And he said the absolute power of hope and how combative it is and how much more braver and adversarial it is than despair and cynicism. Brilliant video. Do watch it. What would be your recipe for adversarial hope of not falling prey to cynicism? How do we defend genuine free speech and free assembly and its takeover, inversion by people like Musk and rioters? And what would you be the first thing you do to start making our democracy stronger?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that we've learned over the last few years of politics and having to see elements of this networked insurgency as it's been evolving is that it doesn't really work. It's actually really, really bad. It doesn't deliver.
Like the Jan 6.
It doesn't deliver. I mean, look, people voted Trump out because basically he was rubbish in the end. I mean, it's as really simple as that. Boris Johnson, why did we get rid of him? It wasn't even any of this stuff. He was just rubbish. And I think that's the thing. These guys are actually rubbish at delivering. Yes. So you might be great at creating a fascist regime, but
running it
and basically delivering things for people in the fascist regime, not going to happen. Yeah. So I think that's the thing. These people cannot solve our problems. They might go on and on about migration. You can talk about it for as long as you want, but you will not solve. A Nigel Farage regime, fundamentally, he might be a fascist. He might, God knows what he might do. Maybe he won't be a fascist. Who knows? But he might do all sorts of different things. But definitely, I can guarantee you, he will just ruin the country because he's a total idiot. And I think that's the problem, that these guys, their vision and the agenda is based on ideology. Yeah. It's not based on reality. It's not based on science. It's not based on even meaningful experience of doing things. So we have that on our side in a way. The more these people get into power, what we've seen is that they don't work. Like even Modi, we're seeing the sunset of his regime. He's managed to scrape by and win in the last elections, but he lost a huge amount. And everyone was talking about it in India. So that's happening, is that when these people are in power, they have a bit of a run, and then people realize that it's not working. It doesn't work. So I think fascism isn't going to work. The danger is that they are given too much truck in this very short window that we have, with all these challenges coming, like climate change, where we need very fast action and things like that. There is a possibility that things can converge in a way that gets out of control and can lead to social dislocation, chaos, collapse, failed institutions, in a way that can make us very, very vulnerable. And we know that Putin is just literally waiting there on the side, waiting for his moment, waiting for his chance. And he's just won in that respect. So again, there is a genuine huge risk. But my hope is that really, when we look at what happened in response to these riots, the fact is that most ordinary people don't have any truck for fascism. Britain is an anti-fascist country. Democracies have thrived by fighting fascism. And that's the choice that we have to make going forward. And it's going to be a stark choice. But I think the way forward has to be throwing a light and shining a light on what is actually going on, because people do not understand that when they are hearing these kind of memes about migrants and things like that, they don't realize that they are literally being subjected to a networked insurgency. And no one wants to be a tool. Right. And I think that's part of the key. Is the role of journalism here is so important, because we need to be able to shine a light on really how this is working. People don't understand that there is a movement of people who don't really care about our countries and our futures and our children. They just have their agenda. Steve Bannon doesn't care. He's just got what he wants to do. He said that he wants to destroy the state. He called himself a Leninist and said, I'm here to bring down the state. And he wants to tear everything down to put forward the vision that they want. That's what they want to do with Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation 100-page plan for a Trump administration coming in, which is essentially a blueprint to end American democracy and remake the entire system. Now, they want to sell this to us, but who's really going to benefit from this? It's not the public that benefits. It's ultimately, it's tech billionaires, it's financiers, it's white supremacists. It's not all of us. It's not the whole public. And I think that's what people need to understand. And if we can help them to understand that, we're going to have a better chance at fighting this.
Well, I certainly feel in the last 4 years, especially your work, Nafeez, I see more and more people reading this and seeing through the veil of illusion drawn over their eyes to hate strangers when the oligarchs behind their backs are the ones probably exploiting their lives. So Nafeez's book, Alt-Right, should be out in October, which outlines all these things. And as we talk, thank you, Josiah, for coming in. We'll be taking a 2-week break from this show. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'm off to see the other battlefield of Ukraine over the next week, and there are some more developments there which we may report back on when we come back at the beginning of September. Meanwhile, thank you, Nafeez, for all your amazing insights as always.
Thank you, Peter.
And Josiah, thanks for always coming with fresh news. All right, see you again in a couple of weeks.
Byline Audio.